Welcome, welcome. Thank you to everyone who is joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Intent to Make Them Slaves, Enslaved Africans in Maine and Their Resistance in the Mid-19th Century. And thank you to everyone who's watching the recording on YouTube. It is my great pleasure and honor today to welcome Dr. Kate McMahon for her fourth program with us. I think that makes you the most frequent flyer that we have on this program, and for good reason. Kate McMahon is a Maine native and a graduate of the University of Southern Maine. She's also the historian of global slavery at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where she leads research efforts at the Center for the Study of Global Slavery. Since this Lunch and Learn series started, Dr. McMahon has joined us each year to share her work and help us wrap our heads around the pretty uncomfortable truth that Maine vessels, seamen, merchants, and investors were heavily engaged in the foreign illegal slave trade. Today, we will explore the stories of enslaved Africans brought to the United States by Mainers on the ship Transit, Brig Dunlap, and Brig Porpoise in the 1830s and 40s. They navigated the complicated legal system of the US in myriad ways while making their own freedom. Kate, we are so grateful to welcome you back. My name is Kathleen Meal. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting the environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we begin today. You'll hear from Dr. McMahon first, and then we'll tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You can send questions to me at any point. You can send those through the chat as they occur to you, and I'll compile the questions, synthesize those with similar themes, and ask as many as possible following the presentation. Please don't message speakers directly, as we want their focus on the presentation, not the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Maggie Summers through the chat, and she will help you out. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our programs on YouTube, where a number of playlists help you focus in on particular topics. You can find all of Dr. McMahon's previous programs under the Racial Justice and Equity playlist. Thank you again for joining us. And Kate, I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. I'm so happy to be here again. And thank you so much to Kathleen and Maggie for organizing this great event in this series, of course, which is so wonderful. I apologize in advance. Getting over a cold, just like everyone else, I think, in America right now. So a little crackly, but I'm going to do my best to power through. So today I'm going to talk about enslaved Africans in Maine and their resistance to slavery during the mid-19th century. First, I want to start with just a little background about the global slave trade. Slavery touched every continent on Earth, more or less, except maybe Antarctica. It shaped the ways in which people have lived and continue to live across our world. It shaped the hierarchies and dynamics of how we organize our society today. And of course, the legacies of slavery and colonialism are deeply felt throughout the world. The slave trade was driven by waterways within Africa itself. Waterways were the main conduit for enslaved Africans being moved from the center of Africa to the coasts, where they were then loaded onto ships to bring them across the Middle Passage to the Americas or into the Indian Ocean. And many tens of thousands of enslaved people were brought into the Indian Ocean world, well, actually into the early 20th century and then the late 19th century. The slave trade, of course, caused huge demographic shifts within Africa. We know that at least 12.5 million people were trafficked out of Africa during the period of the transoceanic slave trade between circa 1600 and about 1865. But we don't know the true scale and the true scope of those numbers. These are things that scholars are continuing to work on, particularly when we're looking at trying to understand the slave trade to the Indian Ocean, to Asia, and to other parts of the world. That is still really ongoing active scholarship today. The mortality rate aboard these vessels was about 15%. And that tracks for the whole period of the slave trade, but at times, and in particular the period that I focus on, the illegal period, it was often much higher. 30% of people who were put aboard these vessels perished during the Middle Passage. So that equates to about 10.7 million people surviving the Middle Passage to the Americas, to be enslaved in the Americas. So I'll briefly just touch on and try to frame Maine's relationship to the slave trade. Maine certainly had a connection to Africa, and people were being trafficked from Africa to what became the state of Maine in the colonial period, at least by the late 17th century, although the exact date when the first Africans were brought to Maine is unclear. We certainly know that by the 1680s, there was a colonial market for enslaved people in the town of York. And we also have some evidence of the slave trade in the 18th century, early 18th century as well, to the state of Maine. We know that, for example, this document here from 1752 is one of the better earlier documents that we have about that documents the slave trade to Maine. From 1752, the Betsy, which was captained by Samuel Lamphere, brought an unknown number of enslaved Africans to Kittery and sold them in the state of Maine. We can see here some other known Maine-built ships that were trafficking enslaved people either to the United States or to other parts of the Americas during the legal period of slavery prior to 1808. So you can see here a small example, including the Rising Sun from Biddeford, which wrecked with all 241 enslaved people that were aboard the vessel died. So we know that this was a not insignificant number of people, and certainly Maine-built vessels as Maine's shipbuilding industry began to develop in the 18th century and expanded greatly towards the end of the 18th century. We can see that, with that, enslaved people were being trafficked in greater numbers by Maine-built vessels, either directly to what would become the United States or to other places throughout the Americas. We do know that by the early 1780s, the state of Massachusetts, of course, which Maine was part of until 1820, was passing various laws to attempt to abolish the participation of its citizens in the slave trade. So by 1786, the slave trade had been technically made illegal for Massachusetts citizens to participate in. However, that of course didn't stop merchants from engaging in the trade, and we have numerous records to indicate that a number of people, some of our most prominent merchants, like in the state of Maine, for example, Thomas Robeson, who was a merchant out of Portland, he was a rum merchant and was charged with, as well as his crew, were charged with breaking this law and participating in the illegal slave trade. And those records actually are at the Maine Historical Society. Excuse me. So, however, the slave trade it is difficult to assess exactly how many vessels and how many people were engaged in the full extent of Maine's role in the slave trade at this time. There's a few different reasons for that. Number one is that this is sort of emerging scholarship. There is, especially within the last 5 or 10 years, myself, along with a handful of other folks, are really pushing towards trying to understand Maine's relationship to the global economies of enslavement and slavery more broadly, as well as more specifically the slave trade. However, because it's emerging scholarship, we still don't really understand the full extent, and it's something that we are continually researching and trying to put our hands around it. Another issue is that there is a broader misunderstanding of the slave trade, even by maritime historians who do not specialize in slavery, who have historically not focused on the slave trade as part of maritime history. It has often, in the last 50 years, been sort of relegated to its own history and not incorporated into broader maritime historical understandings. So we tend to think of slave ships being specifically built. For example, I'll go back a slide. This vessel here on the right, which is a slave ship called the L'Aurore, which was specifically built for the slave trade. And this is a well-documented vessel that was built in France, and its tonnage and how it was laid out was very well documented. However, the vast majority of ships were not custom built for the slave trade. They were retrofitted. They were intermittently used as slave ships as well as regular merchant vessels. And often even within the same journey, slave ships might go from the United States to Africa, purchase enslaved people in Africa, sell them in the Caribbean or South America, and then return with a load of cargo from these places like sugar and sell that load of cargo back in the United States. So, and that is particularly the case for this period of the illegal slave trade. So we really have a general misunderstanding of the difference between slave ships and merchant vessels, which really convolutes things, because we might classify a ship as a regular merchant vessel when it's not that. There's also, of course, a problem with the fact that, like many parts of the world, our archives are really spread out. And the archives documenting our maritime history and the slave trade are spread between smaller historical societies, which may not have digitized these objects or cataloged them as such, as well as larger institutions. And so it really requires a large-scale methodology of accessing these archives and understanding them, which we don't have yet. So we're working on it, but it's something that's currently in development. And then, of course, there's also this broader issue of, much of this historical research is driven by universities, and currently across New England institutions, there has historically been a lack of leading scholars to bring up a new generation of students who can study this history, excuse me, as well as a lack of funding and concerted effort by universities to support this type of research. The elimination of graduate programs like the one that I went to at the University of Southern Maine, American and New England Studies, really continues to limit our ability to understand and devote time, energy, and funding to this question. So, excuse me, next slide. So the illegal slave trade is the period of the slave trade after 1808 in the United States. In 1807, Great Britain abolished the participation of its citizens in the slave trade, and in 1808, the United States followed suit. Some ships still did actually sail and land in the American mainland illegally with enslaved people on board. Most of these vessels entered ports in the Gulf and the Southeast coasts. The most famous is the Clotilda, which landed in Mobile, Alabama in 1862 in the midst of the Civil War, when it was actually owned and built by a couple of brothers, the Mieher brothers, who had relocated to Mobile from Whitefield, Maine, and started a plantation and steamship building company there, and basically bet that they could bring enslaved Africans into Mobile despite the blockades that were happening, and were successful. And that vessel was actually discovered within the last couple of years. And I have colleagues at the Smithsonian who are currently working on that, as well as with the descendant community that lives there in a community called Africatown. But for the most part, most of these vessels landed were American vessels which landed in other parts of the Americas. So they did not come to the United States, but rather they went to predominantly Brazil and Cuba, depending upon the time period where they landed there. So enslaved people the average life expectancy on a sugar plantation was 7 years. So societies that had which were primarily engaged in sugar production, like Brazil and Cuba and some other places in the Caribbean and South America, always had a need to bring enslaved laborers from Africa to these plantations to work. And so thus these traders from New England, from other parts of the United States, and of course other parts of the world, focused their efforts on bringing enslaved people to those places because they could get a higher profit for them. Of course, this led to untold horrors and death for the enslaved people, as well as resistance by them, which I'll talk about a little later. However, for the United States, what I'm going to talk about today are a small set of cases where I have discovered enslaved people were actually brought to the mainland United States well after the period in which it was made illegal, after 1808, after 1786. So well after the period in which Maine, Massachusetts citizens were not allowed to participate in the slave trade. And this crime by 1820, this was an act of piracy and therefore punishable by death. And yet what we will see is that only one person was ever hung for participation in the slave trade, and that was Nathaniel Gordon from Portland, Maine. And that was in 1862, and I'll talk about his case later. So the first vessel I'm going to talk about is called the Transit. This vessel was built in 1829 by Johnson Williams in Bath, and had a capacity of 199 tons. And the tonnage of a vessel means how much cargo it could carry. So 199 tons of cargo. So it was a moderately sized ship at this time. In 1838, it was captained by a man named Ebenezer Farwell from Vassalboro, and his father was considered to be, one of these founding fathers of Vassalboro, really prominent man. This house, which you see in the background, is the Riverview House in Vassalboro. It's on the National Register, very historic building, and important for the town's history. In 1838, the vessel Farwell took the vessel to Cote d'Ivoire, the border between Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, and returned to the port of New York City with 3 enslaved Africans on board. A 4th enslaved man named Yazzie was actually left here at the Riverview House by Farwell at his home to, quote, work as an indentured servant. So Farwell, this whole ruse was discovered by a man named David Ruggles. David Ruggles was perhaps the most important Black abolitionist who lived in New York City during the early and mid-19th century. He took it upon himself to watch the port of New York for enslaved Africans being illegally brought into the port of New York by these merchants and captains. And he also, there were a number of cases in which he was involved in where free people of color were kidnapped and sold as slaves in the South. So David Ruggles was a really prominent Black abolitionist, and he took it upon himself to make sure that none of these illegal actions were taking place, and advocated for African Americans across the country. And essentially Ruggles discovered that these 3 African men had been brought into the port of New York City. And so he took this information to the marshal and the judge, and Farwell was arrested. He was charged with bringing 4 natives, which included Yazzie, into the port of New York, and was charged with breaking the law of 1818, 1819, and 1820. There were subsequent laws that had been passed during that time period, which were slightly different. Essentially, Yazzie was in Vassalboro during this time period. And so Farwell was ordered to present Yazzie in New York. And so Yazzie was brought to New York. We know very little about Yazzie and the 3 other men that were brought into New York City. What we do know is that they were likely crewmen, which is spelled Krooma-N, which was an ethnic group basically from this part of West Africa, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, the border there, and that they were essentially brought in to be sold and enslaved. Now, we don't know what Farwell's plans were for the 3 men that were in New York, but what we do know is that Farwell argued that Yazzie was indentured, that while he had purchased him in Africa as a slave, that he had technically given him his freedom at sea, and that he was going to make him an indentured servant in Vassalboro and to work on his father's farm. Now, obviously, this doesn't really hold a lot of water when we look at the historical facts. Yazzie was enslaved in anything perhaps but name. However, Ruggles, when this was brought to trial, Ruggles argued that he saw the indenture papers and that those indenturement papers had a forged signature. He argued that these papers that said that Yazzie had been indentured and that he was manumitted were actually forged after the fact, after they got back to the United States, and not during this Middle Passage. However, the court at this time period in New York, the judge that was over this district court in New York City, as well as the marshals, were extremely sympathetic to slave trading. And they were not motivated to prosecute anyone involved in the slave trade. They were not motivated to really push hard against what these men were doing. Farwell obviously was not the only one doing this, and I'll talk about others. And yet the court ultimately found in the favor of Farwell. They ultimately stated that that Yazzie and the other men were free men and indentured, and that they could be returned to Africa, and they ultimately were returned to Africa. However, they were not enslaved, and therefore Farwell was acquitted of all of his charges. So during this time period, Farwell is building this massive grand house in Vassalboro. And if you've ever been to Vassalboro, you've probably seen this house. It sticks out like a sore thumb. It's the only giant Greek revival building in Vassalboro or anywhere near there. It's a huge grand house. So he decided to build this house. It's directly next to the Riverview House where his father lived. And he had begun construction on it in around 1837, early 1838, and then he ran out of money. So he decides in 1841 to go to Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire again. And ultimately, the historical record sort of diverges here. There are multiple accounts and multiple perspectives about what happens. But essentially, he's the captain of a schooner called the Mary Carver, which was built in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And he took it in 1841 to Liberia and goes back to the same place, this border between Cote d'Ivoire and Liberia. And almost certainly, this is a deal related to the slave trade that had gone bad. Essentially, what happens next is that the king of this area, the king of this tribe, the Berebe tribe, who was identified in records as Krakow, ordered that Farwell and his crew were killed and the vessel to be sunk after Farwell had killed multiple emissaries that were aboard the vessel. So Krakow had sent these men to negotiate a trade deal with Farwell. Farwell killed them, probably, didn't like the terms or something. And then in retribution, he and the crew were killed and the vessel was sunk. And of course, this makes it back to the United States fairly quickly. And retribution is brutal. At this same time period, there was an ongoing negotiation between the United States and Great Britain around the United States' lack of prosecuting its citizens' involvement in the slave trade. And so in 1842, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty was passed, and that treaty did three things. One of them was established the northern border of the state of Maine. So it established the line between Aroostook County and Canada. The second, because there had been an ongoing nonviolent war there between lumbermen, essentially, on both sides of this line. It also established the outcome of a case of a vessel called the Creole, which was a slave ship that was going from Virginia to was initially intended to go to New Orleans when the enslaved people on board revolted and sailed the vessel to the Bahamas. And the enslavers in the United States sued the government of Great Britain because they said they wanted their, quote, property back. And ultimately it established that because these enslaved people landed on British free soil, they were free. And then the third thing it did was the United States finally agreed to make their own squadron of naval vessels specifically for identifying, tracking down, and capturing slave ships, American slave ships. Because Great Britain, after the War of 1812, did not have the rights of search and seizure aboard American vessels. They needed a certain level of proof that American naval vessels did not need. So on the left here, you see the first commissioned vessel that was part of the Africa Squadron, the sloop of war Saratoga, which was built at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and launched in July of 1842. And its first commission was to go to Liberia and to hunt down and kill the tribesmen that were involved in the killing of the crew of the Mary Carver. And ultimately, this vessel sailed down the coast of Liberia and raised somewhere around 100 villages, despite the fact that the men who had killed, including the Krakow, were dead. They had already died, and they died in the interim period between this. So they basically razed all of these villages, killed an unknown number of Africans. Probably the motivation being, and it's pretty evident in the naval records related to this, that because these people were resistant to colonization and the trade routes that the Americans were trying to establish along the coast of West Africa. And there's actually some really fascinating documents that have survived. This middle document, which is a little blurry on the screen, I'm sorry, is in the Maine Historical Society, and it is a journal of a sailor that was on board the vessel, on board the Saratoga. So probably one of these men in this picture on the left. And he recounts this whole incident. So, this is obviously a horrific period of injustice for a lot of these Africans. And, at the same time period, it's very evident that, a lot of this is due to the apathy of the United States government, the apathy of people, and really sympathy for slave trading by a lot of people that were working in the legal system, from marshals to judges and others, and a real lack of interest or care in executing the laws of 1808, 1818, 1819, 1820 to their fullest extent. So in the same time, 1838, while Ruggles is working on helping Yazzie and the other men get their freedom, another man was brought into the port of New York by a Mainer. And this man was named George Washington. He was enslaved in Guadeloupe by a man named Lambert Bercier. And he was brought to New York aboard a brig called the Dunlap, which was captained by Nathaniel Gordon of Portland. Nathaniel Gordon, his family were prominent merchants, prominent seamen, and his father actually had been charged previously in the 1820s, 1830s with being engaged in slave trading himself. His name was also Nathaniel Gordon. And he clearly learned something from his father. Other members of their family were known enslavers and slave traders. So there was a real family history here. So in 1838, he had brought the Dunlap to Guadeloupe, and Lambert Bercier wanted to bring George Washington with him to the United States as his personal enslaved person. And so again, David Ruggles comes to his rescue. And this is a quote from the Liberator from August of that year. The case coming to the knowledge of a colored citizen, Mr. Ruggles, who takes an active interest in such matters, he laid the case before the district attorney, Mr. Price, who caused Mr. Bercier, the claimant of the slave, and Nathaniel Gordon, captain of the brig Dunlap of Portland, Maine, who it is said permitted the slave to be secretly conveyed on board his vessel at Point Peter and smuggled into the United States to be arrested forthwith. And so they were arrested. And the outcome of this case is a little hazy. The records have not survived, or they've not been found, that tell us what the outcome of the actual judicial case was. However, I suspect that either they were simply fined or charges were dropped, because a year later, I have found the Dunlap with Captain Gordon sailing around between the Caribbean and the United States yet again. And he was the captain of that vessel until at least 1843. So more than likely, if he suffered any consequences, they were not enough consequences for him to no longer be the captain of this vessel and to stop what he was doing. And in fact, he continued to be engaged in the slave trade at an increasing rate until in 1852, he captained a vessel called the Camargo, which was landed in a place called Braqui in Brazil, where it was sunk. And the enslaved people aboard that vessel established a community called the Quilombo de Braqui, which Quilombo is essentially, it's a maroon community of enslaved people who escaped slavery and established their own community, usually within on the margins of society, within places that were difficult for to access and things like that. And that community still exists today as well. And then in 1860, he captained a vessel called the Erie, and loaded more than 1,000 enslaved people aboard that vessel. That vessel was built in Elliott, Maine. And there he was charged with being engaged in the illegal slave trade and was brought to New York, put in jail, and then ultimately he was hung in February of 1862. And this is an image from Harper's Weekly of his hanging. He was the only person to be hung, and it was more than likely because of his the time period. You know, it's right in the middle of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln had taken a special interest in this case. So, you know, we can really see that Black abolitionists in particular played a key role, especially David Ruggles, but Black abolitionists more broadly played a key role in assisting enslaved Africans who were brought to the United States, in making sure that they knew how to navigate the United States legal system, that they had, you know, the material possessions that they needed. Ruggles outfitted everyone with clothing and lodging and all of these different things that they needed while they were in the United States, and then access to, you know, the remedies that they desired, whether that was to stay in the United States or to go back to Africa. And I'm not sure what happened to George Washington, although we do know that the folks that were aboard the transit did go back to Africa. And so a few years later, we have another enslaved man who was taken as part of the illegal slave trade, although when he came to the United States, he was actually already freed. But this is the case of Pedro Tovucan Paris and that of the brig Porpoise. So the Porpoise was built in Brunswick by a man named Joseph Badger. It was regularly slave trading, beginning at least by 1840. It was engaged in both the domestic United States slave trade, which was legal, moving enslaved people along the eastern seaboard of the United States. In this case, in 1841, it brought enslaved people from, Baltimore to New Orleans, over 100 people. And then after that, it made at least 3 slave trading journeys to Africa on behalf of a Brazilian slave trader named Manuel Pinto da Fonseca. Fonseca was, at this time period, the most prominent and powerful slave trader in Rio de Janeiro, and perhaps in all of Brazil at this time period. He made at least 20 million, the equivalent of $20 million per year, trading enslaved people alone. He also owned a plantation. He owned an auction house. He was very close with the royal family and with all of the, governmental leaders of Brazil, which allowed him to continue this, despite the fact that it was actually illegal in Brazil as well by this time period, to import Africans into Brazil. So Fonseca had generally his method was to send groups of American vessels together to Africa, especially to East Africa and Mozambique. In particular, Mozambique was another Portuguese colony in East Africa. If you're not familiar, I'll have a map on the next slide, but it's directly across from Madagascar in East Africa. And in this case, he had the 5 vessels traveling together: the Kentucky of Boston, which was built in Searsport, but registered in Boston. The Garfilia of Baltimore, the 17th of March, which more than likely had changed its name, so its origins are unknown. The Laguna of New York, and the Porpoise of Brunswick. The Porpoise was the most recently built of these vessels and the fastest vessel. It was also the smallest. It was considered particularly rakish. It was narrow. It could navigate these rivers that are along the coast of East Africa in particular to get up and purchase enslaved people and bring them down to the coast. It also acted as a pilot ship, and it was a lookout, looking out for American and British vessels and men of war that were attempting to catch slave traders. So a total of approximately 1,800 enslaved Africans were loaded over the course of several months in 1844 and departed the Bay of Maputo on the 15th of September, 1844, including this man you see here, Pedro Tovucan Paris. He was born somewhere on the coast of Eastern Africa. In about 1833, his name was Tovucan. This is according to his adoptive brother, Percival Paris, which meant to run away. And he had several siblings. He recounts in this oral history that his brother recorded, his memories of his childhood, that they raised chickens, that they, grew fruits and vegetables. And he talked even about the night of his capture. And this is an exceptionally rare document to have. And it's exceptionally rare for us to know this much about an enslaved person's entire life, from their childhood through their death, especially during this time period of the illegal slave trade, and especially for someone who was taken in the Indian Ocean slave trade. And so he states, he was captured in a night attack on his people by a neighboring tribe. A terrible uproar arose in the night, and his father stepped out of the hut to learn the cause, and he was struck down. The terrified family scattered, attempting to escape. But he was taken, and he found that his 3 brothers were also taken captives. So I have worked in Mozambique as part of my work at the Smithsonian. And the Slave Works Project, and within consultation of some colleagues there, we've determined he's probably a Swahili speaker. So we're beginning to narrow down his ethnicity. And he talks also about that they had an animistic belief structure, meaning that they believed in the power, the spirituality of plants and animals and nature. And that he entered the slave trade, like many others did at this time period, through an act of war. And much of these events were being pushed by colonizers, by European colonizers in the region, who were causing a lot of this conflict and ensuring that they had enough people to enter the slave trade. So he was taken. He recalls the first white man he ever saw, a cruel Portuguese slave trader, named Sebastian, who mercilessly beat the boys to get them to forget their native tongue and to learn Portuguese. Around the 20th of May, 1844, the Porpoise and the Kentucky landed on an island in Maputo Bay called Inyaka, which is off the coast of Maputo. And there, Fonseca and the other Brazilian slave traders met a, quote, Negro king who, quote, kept a depot of blacks for slaves sent down to him for Lourenço Marques, which is in northern Mozambique. Two such captives were Pedro and his brother Luis, and who were held at a Portuguese-controlled slave factory somewhere on the coast until they were taken to Inyaka and sold to Fonseca. Records of the United States consul for Brazil, George W. Gordon, described Pedro and his brother Luis being purchased from a slave dealer named Manuel Henrique by the Brazilian supercargo, which is sort of a someone who is overseeing all of these vessels together, Paulo Rodriguez, for 5 dinheiros, or 5 half-gold doubloons on Inyaka. And my colleagues in Mozambique at the University of Eduardo Mondlane have been doing archaeology to try to determine where this fortress was on Inyaka Island, and have made some tentative discoveries within the last couple of years that it was likely located near this building here, an administrative building on Inyaka, and that there's significant evidence of slave trading and things like that on the island, which was unknown until this research. So the ships landed in Cabo Frio, Brazil, which is east of Rio de Janeiro on November 16th of 1844. They sold their cargoes, all of the enslaved people on board, save for the 3 boys that had been loaded onto the Porpoise: Pedro, Luis, and a boy from Quiamania, which is it's kind of near Maputo, named Guilherme. Fonseca probably auctioned the vast majority of these enslaved people off himself at his auction facility in a town called Ponta do Caju. Gordon had been keeping track of William Gordon, the consul of Brazil. George William Gordon had been keeping track of these ships departing for the African coast and kept a watchful eye on these ships, waiting for these folks to return. They were actually late coming back. He knew that Fonseca was a slave trader, and he saw the ways in which Americans were openly participating in this slave trade, and the exceedingly high mortality rates aboard these vessels. So having sold the majority of their cargoes at Cabo Frio, the ship sailed towards Rio de Janeiro and arrived in that port late in the evening of January 22nd, 1845. Consul Gordon knew that they were expected and overdue, and the vessel called the Raritan, which was another Africa Squadron vessel, sailed alongside them as they entered the port. A free black cook aboard the Kentucky named Peter Johnson, who was from Kingston, New York, threw a rock with a note tied to it aboard the Raritan that said 3 enslaved boys were hidden aboard the Porpoise. The vessel was searched, the boys were found, and the crew of the Raritan seized its captain, Cyrus Libby of Scarborough, and the rest of the brig's crew, including some Brazilian citizens, and arrested them. And so this bottom vessel here is the Raritan, and this image on the upper right is the dock in which they were landed in Rio de Janeiro. What followed was a really tense diplomatic exchange between the United States and Brazil. The Brazilians accused the Americans of overstepping their bounds by arresting Brazilian citizens at a foreign port. And because, of course, many of these Brazilian citizens, were powerful slave traders themselves, they really did not like this, and there was actual guns pointed at each other and a very intense moment. So ultimately, the Brazilian citizens were set free. Fonseca made off with all of his gold and continued to engage in the slave trade until it was finally really abolished around 1850 in Brazil. But Captain Libby, and Pedro were put on the porpoise and brought to Maine. And so what you see here on the bottom is a fantastic portrait of his life that Pedro painted. He was brought to Maine and was adopted by the United States Marshal for Maine. He would have been about 14 or 15 years old at this time. And what you see here on the left is Rio de Janeiro. You can see very clearly these are the same structure. And then in the middle is the porpoise. This hill is Portland, and that's the observatory that you see there. And then on the far right is the family farm where Pedro lived until his death around 1860 of pneumonia in Paris Hill, Maine. So he after this became a Black abolitionist himself. He went on a whistle-stop tour of Massachusetts when George William Gordon ran for governor of Massachusetts in the late 1850s. He was an advocate for anti-slavery, despite, you know, a very short life, that he died when he was quite young. He was, you know, not even 20 years old, or 25 years old. So, you know, his life, like many of these other folks, was really marked by these incidents that ultimately led him to Maine. But we have this incredible material record of his life, unlike what we see with these other men. But, you know, I think these stories are just a drop in the bucket as to how many Mainers were involved in the slave trade. And I've given multiple talks, including here, for Maine conservation voters on this topic in the past. So, you know, I'm going to wrap up for now because I know we're short on time and I want to leave some time for questions. But thank you for bearing with me despite my technical problems and my hoarse voice.
Thank you for bearing with us, Kate, and thanks everybody for being with us today. This is just, you know, the overwhelming question, I think, if there's a theme, is how did we not know this, right? How did we not know this? Why do we still not know this? And I'm so grateful to you. I know we all are, that you're here to share this research with us, Kate, and to really pull back the curtain on the history that we all share. There are lots of different questions that we're not going to get time to, but to ask today, but I think I'm going to boil it down to just this one. How does learning about this history help us better understand our present?
You know, I think the fact that there has been this erasure of these people from the historical record, from our collective memory, says a lot about the ways in which white supremacy and racism are really part of our social structure and are really baked into our institutions. From our judicial systems, we can look back to this time period and see many of these issues still persist in the present day. You know, these injustices, this forced labor still exists, slavery still exists, all of these things still exist today. And, you know, many of them have taken on new forms, new shapes, are expressed in different ways, but they still are part of our present and part of our collective identities, that this is, you know, this is part of American history. It's ugly, it's uncomfortable, it's painful, but it's important for us to acknowledge that these things exist. It's important for us to acknowledge that these people existed, that they resisted these things, and the varied ways in which they resisted these things. You know, we have, you know, people who are petitioning, people who are actively, you know, advocating and working and trying to navigate the legal system and do all these things. You know, these people existed and worked hard, and the fact that they were left out of our broader history books. I mean, the fact that we have all these fascinating things from Pedro, and he's not someone we teach about in, Maine history schools and things like that. This fascinating person from East Africa, came here, and of course, there's this deep connection between these folks, I think, and this new wave of African immigrants who have come to Maine in the last like 30 years too. So, I think there's all of these different ways in which we can better understand our present day by understanding our history and finding ways to really unpack all of this history.
As always, I just want to spend the next month straight trying to absorb everything that you have learned and researched and laid out in such a compelling way. I'm so grateful to you. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining to confront this really difficult history together. Want to point all of you to the follow-up email that you'll get later this afternoon. We'll have a link to this recording, and it will also have information about a really powerful event coming up on Monday to help us reflect on Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, and has some wisdom to share with us about evolving thinking on gun safety, which feels particularly resonant at this moment. There's what else is there to say other than thank you? And we are already eager for the next time that we all meet up in this space. We will be here for a lunch and learn next week on clean car standards. Feels like a very different kind of topic, but it's all about how we build the kind of future that will support and sustain all of us. So thank you for being part of that work. Kate, thank you for all you do and for sharing it with us. And I hope you all have a wonderful long weekend and a thoughtful Martin Luther King Day as well.